Hey John, thanks for your response. I think you're right that if we try to understand how it is that we learn, if not to be conscious, at least learn to experience our visual field coherently, that we might make some headway into understanding this relationship between primary and secondary qualities, or if there is a relationship or a gap between the two at all. It reminded me of some patients that were blind um, since birth, and they were adults at this point, and they had a surgery which reattached the nerve to their retina such that their eye then was capable of functioning, at least physiologically, um, as it should. But when they healed and opened their eyes, they were met with this total incoherent chaos. They couldn't distinguish objects or colors, and most of the patients reported that they would much rather have remained blind than have this rather frightening and obtrusive visual experience. So what this points to, I think, is the idea that we have to learn to see. The eye isn't something that just works automatically when you flip a switch. You have to grow into it. So unless we have this built-up experience since infancy of learning to move about the world and use our eyes actively to discriminate various colors and objects in the world, it won't work. Um, so I appreciate you pointing in that direction. I think that's helpful. Um, but you assume though that red is a frequency, which that's one way of looking at this problem. I mean, that's what typically is called the objectivist view, that red is a particular frequency in the world, which that's not always true because sometimes there is no direct correlation between the frequency and the color perceived. When you change the lighting in a room or you put two different colors next to each other, the context makes what otherwise would appear red to appear brown or whatever. So sometimes the wavelength is not equal to the color, and there's no relationship between the two. So the objectivist view doesn't always work, nor does the subjectivist view, because then we're left with this notion of qualia that is it's incoherent, um, because where are they? What are they? Why would we even suppose that these hypothetical entities or sense experiences exist, other than to save an otherwise incoherent theory? So really what I'm trying to do here is point to the fact that a lot of our scientific uh, attempts at explanation for conscious experience um, end up reversing the common sense picture, which is that science should help elucidate our experience rather than directly conflict with it. Because when we say something like, well, neuroscience proves that consciousness is an epiphenomena that is reducible to the chemicals and electrical activity of the brain, and it therefore is completely determined by those physical interactions. When we say that, it completely contradicts our direct experience, which is having some degree of free will, right? So in that case, science has gone against this. I would think this central foundation, which that is that it should be empirical. It should be based in our experience of the world, um, and instead of being based in our experience, it's starting with these abstractions, with these laws of nature, and physics and chemistry and so forth, and trying to derive from those an explanation for our experience. I think that's backwards. It is our experience that makes us value pursuing these kinds of explanations, or makes some of us value these kinds of explanations at least. And we judge that they are valid and explanatory based on our conscious experience and our ability to make decisions and choices like this. So, rather than try to bring quantum physics into this or anything, I'd rather stick to this idea that we need to recognize the place or the nature and scope of science, that it is supposed to help us understand experience. It is not supposed to explain away experience. It's not supposed to contradict our experience. So I'm going to keep thinking about this, and what it really requires, I think, is a whole paradigm shift, you could say, or just a transition or transformation of our way of experiencing ourselves, because John Locke and Galileo and Newton and Descartes, the guys that recognized or asserted this distinction between subjective and objective, or secondary and primary characteristics, they experience this as being true and somehow. So it's a reflection of their feeling of what it means to be human. And in order to rectify this misapprehension, we need to transform our experience and become human in a new way, in a way that hasn't been recognized for the past few hundred years, such that it no longer becomes valid to try to reductively explain away our conscious experience based on determinate physiochemical laws. And I think for a lot of people it's already the case that is impossible, but still, I think, at least in academia, it's very much, the main thrust of the research is towards just such an explanation. So it's all coming back to how we experience human life, what we imagine our consciousness to be, which is tricky because our own ability to imagine is consciousness. So it's definitely this self-reflective process, and it's not simple by any means, but it's certainly worth paying attention to. It's worth doing some work on, because science has, due to this distinction between subject and object, ignored the subjective half as kind of not important. It's ignored it for the last 400 years, and it's only within the last 20 to 15 or so years that consciousness has become a legitimate area of study, because it's become quite obvious, I think, that a scientist's particular values, their particular socio-political background and perspective and so forth, influences the kinds of experiments that they choose to do, but also the results that they derive from those experiments. So even from within science itself, it has been recognized that we need to understand what this whole consciousness thing is. I mean, just look at quantum physics. The place of the observer is coming to play a much larger role than classical Newtonian physicists ever would have imagined, and it's making it a lot messier than a lot of reductionists would have hoped. But we can clean up the mess, but it requires going back to the metaphysical foundations of materialism, I think. So it really requires cleaning house a bit, and it's hard work, but I'm glad you're along for the ride, and I look forward to your further contributions. So thanks for your response.